There's a small, secluded community in the Appalachian Mountains called Shadow Valley. They say the place is cursed, that something in the woods never sleeps, never forgets. To the locals, it's an old truth, passed down through generations as a warning. Keep your lights on and your doors locked during the full moon. To Nora Morrigan, who left the valley more than a decade ago, it all seemed like rural superstition, stories meant to scare children. But when her father, Caleb, enters his final days, Nora finds herself forced to return to the home she swore she would never visit again. Yet her return to the dark vale is a confrontation with more than the painful memories of her childhood or the tragedy of her brother Elias's disappearance. There is something alive in the forest, something the Morrigan family has kept at bay for generations at terrible cost. And when Nora discovers the dark secret surrounding her lineage, she realizes that perhaps she herself holds the key to breaking the curse, or fueling it. Morrigan's old car sputtered loudly as it crossed the wooden bridge that marked the entrance to Dark Valley. The boards creaked beneath her wheels, echoing through the quiet valley. It was the kind of silence that felt unnatural. Nothing but the sound of the engine and the wind around her. The bridge was the same as it had been in her childhood, though more worn, with patches of wood blackened by age and moss. Nora opened the steering wheel, taking a deep breath. There was nothing heavy about this place, as if the atmosphere itself wanted to hold her there. She didn't want to be back, but her Aunt Ruth's call was insistent, almost desperate. "Your father doesn't have much time," Ruth said, her voice shaking. "You need to come. And, Nora, there are things we need to talk about." The second sentence had been playing in her mind the entire drive. The last time she'd heard anything like it, she'd been 17 and Caleb had locked the windows, turned off the lights, and said prayers under his breath that the blood Morrigan needed to be protected. Morrigan family home was the largest in the valley, but also the darkest. An old Victorian that stood like a weary giant on a hilltop. The windows were dusty and blind, the porch steps were sagging, and the once white paint was stained grey. As a child, Nora had thought the house was a magical castle. Now, it looked like a tomb. She parked and got out of the car, bracing herself against the bitter mountain cold. The wind rustled the dry leaves on the ground, and the branches on the trees creaked, bending as if to envelop her. Nora lifted her suitcase from the trunk and walked up the creaking steps to the porch. Before she could knock, the door slowly opened, and Ruth's thin figure appeared. "Nora," Ruth said, the brightness in her voice visible. Her face was more lined than Nora remembered, and her eyes were sunken, with dark circles that spoke of sleepless nights. "You came." "Of course I came," Nora replied hesitantly. Ruth pulled her into a tight hug, as if she feared her niece would disappear if she didn't hold her. Nora returned the gesture, although she could feel the tension in her aunt's body. "Where is he?" Nora said, referring to her father. Ruth pointed upstairs. "Not in the bedroom, but he's not talking much. He raves sometimes. And other times," she trailed off, looking away. "Other times, he talks too much." Nora frowned, but she ushered Ruth inside. The inside of the house seemed darker than it should have been, as if daylight couldn't penetrate the thick walls. The smell of old wood mingled with something more acrid, like burning herbs. Nora climbed the stairs, each footstep echoing in the empty hallway. When she reached Caleb's room, she hesitated before entering. Her father lay in bed, covered to his chest by a thick blanket. His skin was pale, almost yellow, and his eyes were closed, sunken into deep sockets. He looked like a shadow of the stern man she remembered. Nora sat in the chair beside the bed, watching him. He opened his eyes for a moment and looked at her, but there was no recognition in his gaze, only fear. "You would never have gone back," he whispered, his voice so low Nora had to lean in to hear. She tried to answer, but he closed his eyes again, mumbling words that made no sense, something about blood debts and ancient callings. Nora pleaded, feeling a shiver run down her spine. When she returned to the hallway, she found Ruth waiting for her. "What did he mean by that?" Nora asked. "Blood debts?" Ruth looked away, her expression uneasy. "There are things about our family you don't know. Things he should have told you a long time ago." Nora crossed her arms, feeling the tension in her throat. "Elias," she said, almost in a whisper. The name of her younger brother, who had been missing for so many years, seemed to bring up a buried pain. "This has to do with Elias, doesn't it?" Ruth hesitated before answering. "Elijah didn't disappear. He was taken." Nora's eyes widened, her heart racing. Taken? By who? Ruth opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, a howl echoed in the distance. Long, deep, and so full of pain that Nora felt her skin crawl. Ruth froze, staring at the window as if expecting to see something outside. "They're here," Ruth said, her voice barely audible. "That's why you shouldn't have come back." Nora watched Ruth, waiting for an explanation for what she had just heard. But her aunt was restless, her eyes fixed on the window, as if she expected to see something at any moment. The howling that echoed across the mountains seemed closer now, and Nora felt the familiar tightness in her chest, as she had when she was a child, hearing those same sounds. She shook her head, trying to dispel the feeling. "Why did you say they're here?" Nora asked, her voice low but urgent. Ruth took a deep breath before answering, her eyes still avoiding Nora's. "Because they always come, Nora. Whenever there's Morrigan blood in the valley during the full moon. I thought maybe time had driven them away, but it seems your presence has brought them back. Are you telling me that these wolves or whatever they are after me?" Nora laughed, but the tension in her voice was evident. "That's crazy, Ruth." Ruth finally looked at her, and there was something in her eyes that made Nora's heart race. "They're not just wolves, Nora. They're older than anything you can imagine. More vicious than any story you've ever heard, and they're bound to us by something Caleb never had the courage to explain to you." "I don't understand," Nora said, her voice rising. "What are you talking about? What connection is this? And what does Elias have to do with it?" Elias's name seemed to hang in the air like a shadow. Ruth hesitated, as if considering whether to tell the truth or not. But before she could answer, another sound cut through the night. Not a howl this time, but a scratching, like claws against wood. It was faint, but unmistakable. Nora froze, her eyes darting to the front door as Ruth stood quickly, moving toward the windows. "Turn off the lights," Ruth whispered urgently. Nora hesitated, but her aunt's expression was so grave that she hurried to extinguish the candles and lamps that illuminated the room. The house plunged into darkness, and for a moment everything was silent again. But then the scratching returned, louder and closer. Nora held the edge of the table to steady herself, while Ruth positioned herself by the window, holding a crucifix in one hand and a knife in the other. "Ruth," Nora began, but her voice died when she saw what was outside. Something large was moving among the trees at the edge of the yard. The light from the full moon reflected off a pair of eyes that glowed like embers, and Nora realized with horror that she was not alone. Other eyes appeared, blinking between the tree trunks, and she saw the silhouettes of enormous creatures, their bodies like a fusion of wolf and man. Their claws gleamed in the moonlight, and their movements were lithe, almost elegant, as they circled the house. "My God," Nora whispered, stepping back. "Don't make any noise," Ruth muttered, her eyes fixed on the window. "They only come in if you invite them, or if they feel weak." Nora wanted to ask what that meant, but the words caught in her throat. One of the creatures stepped forward from the shadows of the forest. The moonlight revealed its full form, muscular, with glossy black fur and a mouth full of sharp teeth. It moved slowly toward the porch, the boards creaking beneath its weight. "This can't be real," Nora whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's real," Ruth replied, her voice firm but shaky, "and they won't stop until they get what they came for." Before Nora could ask what that meant, the creatures began to attack. The sound of splintering wood filled the air, and Nora saw the front door shake under the impact of a powerful blow. Ruth moved quickly, pushing Nora into the hallway that led to the basement. "Get down," Ruth ordered, "now!" "You're coming with me," Nora said, grabbing her aunt's arm. "I must buy time," Ruth replied. "Now go." With no choice, Nora ran toward the basement, her heart beating so fast she could barely breathe. The sound of the creatures attacking the house seemed to be everywhere, each impact echoing off the walls. She ran down the steps, nearly falling, and slammed the door behind her, locking it with the rusty latch. The basement was dark and damp, with a musty smell filling her nostrils. Nora grabbed a flashlight that hung on a nail in the wall and turned it on, casting a yellowish light across the space. Around her were old boxes, rusty tools, and dust-covered shelves. But something caught her eye. Deep in the basement was a metal safe, partially hidden by a worn carpet. With trembling hands, Nora pulled aside the rug and opened the safe. Inside was a small wooden box, sealed with a padlock. She picked it up and opened it to find a dagger with a silver blade covered in ancient-looking inscriptions. Beside the dagger was a piece of parchment with writing she could not decipher. Before she could examine further, the sound of wood being broken above her made her freeze. The creatures were inside the house. Nora gripped the dagger tightly, slicing the cold blade in her hands. It was heavy, as if the silver carried more than just the weight of the metal. She didn't know why, but it felt right to hold it, as if it were an extension of something deep in her soul. Upstairs, the sound of furniture being dragged and wood splintering filled the house. The creatures were searching for her. She took a deep breath, trying to control her panic. Her mind raced with unanswered questions. Why was her family involved in these things? What was Ruth hiding? And most of all, what was she supposed to do now? But before she could come up with a plan, the basement door shuddered. Nora held her breath, clutching the dagger to her chest. The knocks grew louder, each impact echoing through the cramped space. The light from the flashlight wavered, creating shadows that also moved around her. Then the door cracked, and one of the creatures poked its head through the hole, its yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. Nora froze, unable to move or scream. The thing roared, the sound like thunder reverberating through her gut. Suddenly, a different sound came from the moment. It was Ruth, shouting words that Nora could not understand. Something in her voice made the creature hesitate, and for a moment, it backed away. Nora took advantage of the distraction to move, hiding behind a wooden shelf. With the dagger in hand, she peeked between the shelves and saw Ruth standing at the entrance to the basement, holding a makeshift torch made of a wooden stick and a piece of burning cloth. "Go back to the shadows from whence you came," Ruth said, advancing with the torch. The creatures retreated, but not for long. One of them leapt up and tackled Ruth to the ground, its claws ripping through the air as she tried to shield herself with the torch. Nora watched her aunt struggle, but one creature was too strong. She knew she had no choice. Heart pounding, she burst from her hiding place and ran toward the creature, plunging the dagger into its back with all the strength she could muster. The monster let out a scream that seemed to come from its soul, recoiling and struggling like a wounded animal. The light from the dagger shone for an instant, as if it had a life of its own, and the creature fell to the ground, turning to ash before her eyes. Nora fell to her knees, gasping for breath while Ruth crawled away. "Nora," Ruth said, her voice weak. You did this." Before Nora could respond, the sound of more howls filled the air. There were more of them, many more. Shadows danced on the walls as the other monsters descended the stairs, their claws gleaming and their eyes fixed on her. Nora gripped the dagger tightly, anticipating a new determination rising within her. If this was what needed to be done, she would do it. "Ruth," she said, helping her aunt to her feet, "we need to get out of here." Ruth nodded, but her movements were slow, her eyes filled with pain. Nora supported her as they moved toward a trapdoor deep in the basement that led outside. The creatures followed close behind them, their heavy footsteps echoing like drums. Nora pushed open the trapdoor and stepped out into the woods, pulling Ruth behind her. The cold night air hit her face, and the light of the full moon illuminated the surrounding forest. The trees stood even taller and more oppressive, their shadows covering the ground like outstretched fingers. Nora looked back and saw the creatures emerging from the basement, their huge, muscular bodies moving with frightening grace. "We can't run forever," Ruth said, her voice barely audible. Nora knew she was right. They had a plan, but they didn't have time. The creatures were getting closer by the second, their howls and growls filling the air. Finally, they reached a clearing and Ruth fell to her knees, unable to continue. Nora turned to face them, dagger in hand, feeling her fear give way to desperate rage. "Come," she said, her voice echoing through the forest. "If that's what you want, come!" The creatures advanced, and Nora shielded herself like never before. Each blow of the dagger seemed to shame the monsters, turning them to ash, but they kept coming. She knew she couldn't fight forever. Her strength was running out, and the creatures were endless. Finally, one of them knocked her down, the dagger falling from her hand. Nora tried to get up, but a creature was on top of her, its claws pressed against her chest. She looked into the monster's eyes and saw something familiar, something that looked human. "Elias?" she whispered, her voice breaking. The monster hesitated, its claws relaxing for a moment. Nora felt tears stream down her face. "If there's any of you left in there, please, stop!" The monster loomed over Nora, its claws pressing into her chest, but not cutting through her flesh. Its eyes, so fierce moments ago, now seemed wavering, as if recognizing something other than the instinct to kill. Nora stood still, her body tense, expecting the worst. She felt the weight of the beast on her, but she realized that the monster was not attacking her. It was hesitating. "Elias," she whispered again, her voice shaking. "It's you, isn't it?" The monster tilted its head, a gesture that seemed almost human. For a moment, Nora saw something familiar about the creature, something that made her believe her brother was still there, buried beneath layers of ferocity and curse. The monster's gaze shifted to the dagger lying on the ground beside her, and it let out a low growl, as if fighting something inside itself. "Nora!" Ruth's voice caught her attention, and Nora turned her head in time to see her aunt staggering into the clearing, carrying a flaming torch. "Get away from him!" "No!" Nora cried, reaching out to stop Ruth from attacking. "Wait! He won't hurt me!" "You don't understand," Ruth snapped, her voice thick with despair. "He's not Elijah anymore. There's nothing in him but the curse." Nora looked back at the monster, who stood motionless over her. His eyes still glowed, but their earlier ferocity had faded. She felt the creature's heavy breathing hot against her skin, and for the first time realized how exhausted he looked. He was fighting, against what she didn't know, but the fight was there. Before she could do anything, another of the creatures emerged from the shadows, attacking with terrifying speed. It charged straight at Ruth, knocking the woman to the ground and knocking the torch away. Nora screamed, trying to get up, but the weight of the monster on her kept her pinned down. She watched Ruth struggle, but her aunt did not have the strength to face something so large and so ferocious. "Elias, please!" Nora cried out, desperate. The monster above her reacted. It let out a guttural roar and lunged at the other creature, knocking it off Ruth. The two beasts rolled across the ground, snarling and snapping at each other with a violence that made the air vibrate. Nora seized the opportunity to stand up, picking up the dagger from the ground. Heart pounding, she ran to Ruth, helping her to her feet. "Are you okay?" Nora asked, panting. Ruth nodded, but her eyes were fixed on the fight between the creatures. He's protecting you," she said, almost in disbelief. "But it won't last. The curse always wins, Nora. Always." Nora looked at Elijah, or what was left of him, struggling against the other creature. She knew Ruth was right. No matter how much Elijah resisted, the curse would eventually consume him again. And then he would be like the others, unstoppable, relentless. "We have to finish this," Nora said, gripping the dagger tightly. "I can't let him live like this. It's not fair." Ruth placed her hand on his shoulder, her eyes filled with sadness. "You know what you need to do." Nora nodded, tears streaming down her face. She walked toward the fight, each step feeling like a hammer against her heart. Elias was still fighting the other creature, but it was clear he was losing. The other beast was bigger, stronger, and its attacks were relentless. Elias grunted in pain as he was thrown against a tree, his form swaying for a moment. Nora stopped a few feet away from him, the dagger trembling in her hand. "Elias," she said, her voice cracking, "if you're still there, please forgive me." The monster turned to her, yellow eyes meeting hers. For a moment, she saw something that looked like acceptance. He knew what was coming, and he didn't resist. Nora took a deep breath, raised the dagger and plunged it into his chest. The light that emanated from the blade was blinding. Elias let out a scream of pain and relief, and his body began to crumble into ash. Nora fell to her knees, clutching the dagger as her brother's ashes scattered in the wind. The other creature roared, but before it could strike, the light from the dagger intensified, reaching out and turning it to dust. When it was all over, silence returned to the forest. Nora fell to her knees, still holding the dagger, as tears fell freely. Ruth slowly approached, placing her hand on her shoulder. "You did what needed to be done," Ruth said, her voice thick with sadness. "I killed my brother," Nora replied without looking up. "How can that be right?" Ruth didn't answer. There was nothing she could say to ease Nora's pain. They stood there for a long time, enveloped by the silence of the forest, until they finally decided to go back to the house. The walk back to the house was slow and silent. The dagger still felt heavy in Nora's hands, even after she had sheathed the blade. The forest around her felt different now. There were no more sounds of creatures or the restless rustling of trees. Dark Vale felt empty. But this emptiness didn't bring peace. It was the kind of silence that came with irreparable loss. Ruth walked beside Nora, her figure more frail than ever. The pale light of the full moon illuminated her tired face, scarred from the night's battles. They reached the house just before dawn. The windows were shattered, the door hung on its hinges, and the furniture was destroyed. The home Nora had left years ago was now a reflection of what she felt inside, in ruins. Inside the house, Ruth sat in a chair that was still standing, resting her head in her hands. Nora stood in the middle of the room, staring at the wreckage. Her gaze fell on a framed photograph that miraculously remained intact on one of the walls. It was an old photo of her family, Caleb, Ruth, Elias, and herself. They were smiling, their eyes shining with a happiness that seemed to belong to another life. "I killed him," Nora said finally, breaking the silence. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried weight. "I killed the only piece of family I had left." Ruth lifted her head, but said nothing. She knew that no words could ease the guilt Nora carried. After a long moment, she finally spoke, her voice hoarse with emotion. "Elias was lost for a long time, Nora. What you did was set him free." "Free him?" Nora laughed, but it was a hollow, joyless sound. "That doesn't change the fact that I drove a blade through his chest, that I erased him from the world. Sometimes the greatest mercy is to end suffering," Ruth replied, though her voice was shaking, as if she didn't quite believe what she was saying. Nora shook her head, unable to accept it. She turned to the window, looking at the sky that was beginning to lighten with the first rays of sunlight. Outside, the valley seemed almost peaceful, but Nora knew that this peace was temporary. It always was. "Is it really over?" she asked without turning around. "Or will you keep coming back like you always do?" Ruth didn't answer right away. She looked at the floor, her fingers gripping the arms of her chair as if for support. "The curse never completely lifts," she said finally. "It sleeps sometimes for years, but it never goes away. As long as there is Morrigan blood, it will always find a way." Nora closed her eyes, feeling the weight of those words like a stone on her chest. "So it was all for nothing," she said bitterly. "It wasn't for nothing," Ruth said. "You gave Elijah something he never had, the choice to end this, and you still get to choose what to do now." Nora turned, facing her aunt. "And what do I do now, Ruth? How do I live knowing that this will never end, that this thing could come back at any moment?" Ruth took a deep breath, rising from her chair with difficulty. "You can leave, Nora. Leave the valley behind again, or you can stay and fight, as your father did. But whatever you choose, do it knowing that the Morrigan blood will always be a part of you. And what you do with it is what matters." Nora didn't answer. She didn't have the strength to argue or to make a decision. She climbed the stairs, ignoring the creaking steps, and entered her old room. The space was practically untouched, as if time had stopped there. She sat on the bed, holding the dagger in her hands, and looked out the window. Outside, the sun was rising, but for Nora there was no relief in the daylight. She knew she couldn't stay in the dark valley. The memories, the losses, the curse, it was all a weight she couldn't bear. But at the same time, running away felt wrong. She thought of Elijah, of his sacrifice, and of Caleb, who had spent his life fighting something he could never overcome. Maybe she could do it differently. Maybe there was a way to end this once and for all. When she came back downstairs, Ruth was still in the living room, staring at the photograph on the wall. Nora walked over to her, stopping beside her. "I'll find a way to end this," Nora said, her voice firm but low, "no matter what the cost." Ruth looked at her, surprised, but said nothing. There was something in Nora's eyes that made her realize she was determined. Finally, Ruth nodded. "Then do it," Ruth said, "and finish what Caleb never could." Nora left the house soon after. She drove away from the dark vale, but not with the intention of running away. She had a purpose now, a mission. And for the first time in her life, she felt that perhaps she might have the power to change the fate that the Morrigan family had been carrying for so long. But as she crossed the old wooden bridge at the end of the valley, she heard a distant sound, carried on the wind, a long, deep howl that seemed to come from somewhere very ancient. Nora did not look back. She knew the fight was not over.